Hello, everybody, and welcome to another great episode of My EdTech Live. Thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful day. And wherever it is that you're joining us from around the world, thank you, as always, for all of your support. We appreciate all the likes, the shares, the follows. And as you know, we do what we do for you to bring you some amazing guests, amazing conversations, and amazing content to continue to help us as professionals continue to grow not only professionally but personally too as well. So I'm really excited about today's show. We have a two-time guest now, and I'm really excited because his book just came out recently, and I'm honored to be, at least one of the first podcasts that he's on. So we can go ahead and have a wonderful conversation and share the joy of going beyond the bulletin board. And I know that our guest will definitely share a little bit more about that. But again, I would love to introduce you to Jed Stefanowicz, who is joining us here today. Thank you, Jed, for joining us. How are you today?
Fonz, it's great to see you. I'm doing awesome, and yes, I am a returner, so I'm thrilled to be a returner, and it's good to catch up with you. It was pretty cool. We were both at ISTE last summer, and we happened to be in the same place at the same time, not at the conference. And I kind of looked over, and I'm like, wait a minute, I know that razor hair. I know who that is. And it was cool. It was good to catch up. So now we've gotten to catch up on screen, off screen. And I appreciate you. Yes, it is one of the first podcasts to talk about this book, but you were also one of the first to read the book. So I want to thank you for being an advanced reader. And I really loved that you called it a practical guide. You said a lot of great things, but calling it a practical guide right from the jump is exactly what I wanted this book to be. It's kind of like the book, you know, the manual for how to do the job I just got hired to do.
There you go. Well, that's great, Jed. And yes, it was definitely great just to catch up and just turn over and be like, hey, I know you. So it was just great again, just to really catch up and meet you in person and just talk and connect. And obviously through the show, this is one of the best things that I love about my tech life and my experience through it, that I get to meet some amazing people online. And then when I get to meet them in person, it's just like we've already known each other for a long time based on an hour conversation from the podcast, but it's all about those lifelong connections. And again, anything that we can do also to continue to amplify voices. So I'm really excited to talk about your book. And yes, I am thrilled and honored of keeping me top of mind to be an early reader and just review it and check out the great stuff that you are doing. So I'm really excited to dive in because I know that the content here is going to be great for all teachers, and especially I see it as a great book to pass along to new teachers that may be coming in, that are going to need a little bit of just that little extra help, but also even for veteran teachers, just to kind of add a little bit more spice to what they may be already doing. Like I always say at the end of the show, just to sprinkle on, some of those knowledge nuggets to what they are
Right on.
already doing great. So, Jed, before we dive in, for any audience members that are joining us today or listening here on the podcast, that may not be familiar with you yet and the work that you do, can you go ahead and give us a little brief introduction and what your context is in the education space?
Sure, happy to. I am a lifelong educator. This is year 30 for me in the biz. I just started a new role this year as an administrator, which is, a really interesting growing point for me. It's a great challenge. It's a cool next phase. But I'm a director of digital learning and innovation here in Massachusetts at Neshoba Regional School District. For the past 6 years, I was a digital learning coach. And then before that, I taught third grade for 22 years. Before that, I was a child. So this is the only thing I've ever done, and it's definitely where I belong. Our bodies are kind of on that September to June, Happy New Year come September routine. So, so yeah, that's what I've done. An elementary educator, and then using a lot of technology. And mine was the classroom that had early emerging technology and kind of became a showcase classroom. And I loved presenting and sharing what I was doing. And it kind of turned into a bunch of different ways of doing that more formally, whether through coaching or presenting or consulting or, now being an author too. So I love doing it. And I love, we just had a conversation before we started that I think what keeps us in it, what keeps us in schools, even though we get to do these kind of things too, is at the end of the day, it's all about student learning, right? It's all about the end user of those whether it's onboarding, whether it's selecting the tool, whether it's finding the cool robot. At the end of the day, we know if it's not about student impact, we know it's going to come and go quickly.
Yes,
So
absolutely. No, I agree with you 100%. And, and at the end, oftentimes, and for, like ourselves in these roles where we're kind of maybe not so much within the classroom as we used to be, because now we're working with our teachers and we're working with different campuses and so on. But, it's always great, like you mentioned, to keep top of mind that who is going to be my final end user, which is the student. So, obviously making things as practical as possible for our teachers, but also to make it fun and engaging and easily deliverable, to our students as well. So you're absolutely right. So let's go ahead and dive in. First and foremost, before I start asking you any questions, well, more so about the book, I want to know a little bit of the backstory behind the book. So please, if you can just share a little bit with us when that moment hit, that light bulb went off, that aha moment that you said, you know what? I've got something here that I want to share, and this is what I would love to share with our education space. So tell us a little bit about that backstory.
for sure. It's excuse me. This is third book I've written, which is really interesting. The first book was really about me and my ideas. The second book was about other people who I found fascinating and interesting. And this book is really about the person who receives it. And that's really what, we've now used the word practical a few times. And it's really, so it's called Beyond the Bulletin Board, Crafting a Culture of Content Creation. And, it's interesting being content creation has kind of been a buzzword. It's that idea of, again, that familiar phrase of shifting students from being content consumers to content creators. For me, that really was a transformational. The first time I heard it was transformational because it really framed what it was I cared most about, what I found to be most engaging as an educator, and what I knew I needed as a student as well. So, like you had said, those immediate takeaways. What is it that's practical, that can be implemented right away? So that's what this book is really intended to be, is for any educator, any administrator to think about. And it does go whether it's a brand new teacher or whether it's someone who's been teaching for 30 years, like myself, because that's where I see that magic is someone who has really come to their own conclusion rather than being either mandated or voluntold to go to a conference or paired up, maybe mentored, but someone who really just comes to that conclusion that, okay, I want to take the next step. I want to, and it might just be as simple as I want to start Book It because everyone else seems to, I close my eyes for 2 minutes and now there it is. Or I really want to reimagine the way that student publishing looks in my classroom, or I really want to rethink. So that's why I think the title speaks for itself, Beyond the Bulletin Board. Um, Especially, that's such a great metaphor that any teacher can understand. Are we decorating our halls and walls? And if we are, who is it for? Who's really looking at it? Are we binding these class books that, just live in the classroom? Are we printing student poetry that, if you're lucky, it makes it in a backpack. If you're luckier, it makes it home or on a fridge. But how can we really rethink what that publishing process looks like? If it's really to showcase student understanding, if it's really to make that learning public, the ways we have to do it are amazing, whether it's, having a student podcast or really just sometimes adding a QR code to a printed product. So what I advocate for, and I literally will walk down a hallway and say to a teacher, I love that bulletin board. How can we expand its reach? How can we get, beyond it or get through it? So it's not about tearing down. It's not about, disrupting. And sometimes that lands the wrong way with me because it really feels like dismantling something that someone really cares about to their core. There's a reason really skilled educators return to the familiar things. And it's not out of laziness. It's because it's really pedagogically sound, but it might also be right for extending and the tools we have to extend it. So, thinking about just shifting a traditional bulletin board product to have that really become a gateway in. So a perfect example would be, and this is one that I did with second grade last year is, there was a project on the bulletin board and I took one down. I said, I have an idea. And we came in and we really just, I asked the student to talk about what their construction paper creation and their 3 sentence paragraph, uh, because all of a sudden then you had the oral recitation of it. And then you had them talking about the design of it. And then you had them thinking about telling their story too. And it went from being a really, truly 2 dimensional project to now capturing that student's voice in a way that wasn't represented otherwise, and capturing their thinking in a way that definitely wasn't represented. And the best part was the teacher was able to, really publish it in a way that the aunts and uncles and grandparents were able to see, and it was saved forever. And it's in, when you think about branching that down the line, you're building a digital portfolio, and it's such a different mechanism than just a stack of paper on portfolio day, like I did 25 years ago, to really having a showcase of learning over time. And that's really what assessment has always been about. And now we have ways for capturing it in so many different ways other than just traditional standardized assessments. And I'm not talking about replacing them. I'm just talking about supplementing them. So that we're hearing from students we might not otherwise be hearing from. And I see it happen every day.
Yes, no, yes to everything. And Jed, honestly, like everything that you described. And we'll touch on a couple of things there that I do want to highlight. But again, it always reminds me of the way things were when I was in the classroom. I mean, it was probably, we had just gotten Chromebooks. Maybe for the last 2 years, I was in the classroom, and we only had two Chromebook carts in that school. And I was the teacher that signed them out all year because not a lot of teachers were familiar with it. Again, they were just coming out. It was something novel, but I just loved absolutely just taking the risk and just using them and incorporating them. And again, having the students become creators within the learning process was something that's so advantageous. And I want to highlight something that you said here towards the end when sometimes when you do give those assessments, there are some students that you really don't hear from too much. And not that they're not there taking the assessments, but we're not giving them a voice to really show their learning and showcase their learning. And what I always remember is the story where I had, I won't mention her name, just, just for personal identifiable information, but I had this wonderful student who came in and she was emergent bilingual, just brand new. And she was very quiet, very shy, very reserved. And again, just that being self-conscious of the language and trying to speak it and so on. However, when I would put a Chromebook in front of her, I mean, she spoke loudly and she spoke clearly, and you can tell that there was content mastery because she had a different venue of expressing what she was trying to say in a way that she didn't feel self-conscious or maybe that somebody would make fun of her. But as she was doing those projects, obviously you get the language acquisition. She started practicing. She started using Screencastify. She was creating and adding, audio into slides and so on that by the end of the year, she had never presented in front of anybody throughout the year. Because I always gave the students an option, you can, stand up, share your presentation, or you can submit it this way and so on. At the end of the year, she got up there and she presented and everybody was just in awe and just her language, the acquisition, she had this confidence. She was able to exit out of that bilingual program because of the growth. And again, another thing that you mentioned is essentially with all of these digital learning artifacts that they have, they're essentially building a portfolio where I was able to prove to the administration, to and everybody within that committee to say, this is where the student was when she first came in, and this is where the student is now. And they were able to see that growth. And undeniably, they were just like, no, I mean, there is growth here and the evidence is there. And I think that's something that's very important and I absolutely love. But I want to ask you a question because
Well, hold on, because
yes,
I want to talk about your story.
okay.
That's what this book is about. It's those stories. And when you talk with educator, from educator to educator, that story makes me think of a story and it makes me think of a student. And that's what it's all about. And you're absolutely right. It's empowering that student. And the fact that she was able to, you watch that growth And you saw it in a way, and it takes a certain kind of leadership because someone walking by your room wouldn't have seen what was going on. They had to come in because what they would have seen is maybe kids lined up in front of a screen. And we feel that pushback sometimes. But then when you have that result and you have the story that explains it, that gives all the context. And it made me think of the story. So hold your question because I'm going to tell you this one. And, this was going back years and years ago where, early makerspace days. And I thought it was awesome because I made this makerspace kind of corner of my third grade classroom. And there was a student who wasn't quite at third grade, performing at third grade level in terms of literacy skills. But in the makerspace, he was the kid who would go home and build a tree fort and knew every dinosaur and knew every insect. And he chose the challenge of building a bug catcher. So it was this paper towel tube and all these pieces. And what I thought was awesome was I made this worksheet, which now I realize I just made a worksheet, but it looked like a blueprint and it was kind of the exit ticket, which asked, what did you make in the makerspace? What was your design thinking? And which the idea behind it was great to capture the design thinking. What I really didn't realize was I had turned it into a writing task and I wrecked the whole thing. And I wrecked it for that kid for that day because he had made something. And then I put a roadblock in, I put a hurdle that was an insurmountable hurdle. And I turned it into a writing task that didn't need to be. And then that was when, Seesaw was early at the time. And so the next morning, I literally said, you know what? Get that project you made because I said, save it, get the project and just put it in Seesaw. Tell me about it. And then, like your story, he lit up. He could tell me all about, well, this light draws the bug in and then it catches him. And now I've got it. And this is why I thought about it this way. And did I capture his design thinking? 100%. Did it need to be written? No way. And that's where, I think about when you were talking about your student and providing those different pathways and really widening the walls to provide all those different lanes. If we're forcing everyone to follow that same recipe, it's not a deficit on the student if they're not achieving it. It's a deficit on the space and the teacher who's not providing the way that student needs. If you're really working on topic sentence and that's the task, fine, make it a writing task. But a similar one is graphic organizers, and I write about it. I can't tell you how many times I ended up in battles over you have to complete this graphic organizer, which really is meant to be a support tool to organize thinking. And again, I had turned it into a writing task, or it just becomes a power struggle. And I've seen it time and time again where these things that are supposed to be structures and supports become roadblocks and hurdles for students. And why not just press the record button and have a student tell their story? Like we were taught to sit and listen to their kind of pre-writing story and then, turn on that record, they tell their story, they listen back. That's their organization. That's their planning. So the video doesn't become, the final product output. It's actually can be a planner tool for a student to collect that thinking. So all these it's nothing, it's not actually brand new emerging technology. I'll try not to talk about AI over the next hour. But it's, good teaching comes around and around. It just comes around in different ways and different tools. So, all right, enough about my rant. What was your question?
No, 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 no. Absolutely. Like you hit on some great things there too that I definitely want to unpack and so on. And especially, I think there's just a power in allowing students, like you mentioned, and you mentioned it, also in the book, allowing students to give them that voice and take that ownership of their learning. And oftentimes, I understand that as educators, sometimes we have our set ways and we do things, and there's things that do work, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with kind of spicing things up a little bit and just enhancing and taking it to that next level. As far as content creation and just creating the content over their learning process. And I think that's something that's powerful because, like you mentioned too, when those last 2 years that I was in the classroom, when we had open house, there was not a single paper on any desk or a folder that a parent would take home. I told all my kids they would bring their parents in and they would log into a Chromebook and I say, please show them your Google Drive. And we had Google Drive folders, which like we are talking about portfolios and how that can help enhance the student learning because now it doesn't just become For example, the stuff on the bulletin board and things of that sort. Not that there isn't a place for that. There's some great things there, but you just don't want to kind of create a scrapbook and kind of little things like that that you take at the end. You want to have at least what I saw in mind. I was like, I want them to have a digital artifact that is editable that they can come back, whether it's next year when they're in sixth grade, or they can come back in eighth grade, or they can come back and they have something there that they can build off of or continue to save their work. And that was something that I continually let them know. So, make sure that you always save your work. And there was a power too. And I love that you mentioned Seesaw because that was my go-to tool to be able to build that community, connect parents to the student work. And when I had students that would come in and record their explanations, I was able to share that with the parents immediately. And the parents absolutely loved it. The students loved it because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm sharing this with an authentic, genuine audience because it wasn't just with their parents. We had like a little parent group. So everybody got to see and they got to share. And even the parents were like just excited that they would get to see other students work and they were cheering everybody on. And that sense of community that went beyond like you mentioned, the bulletin board, it went beyond the walls of the classroom, but it was just something so simple that it just doesn't really take too much time, but it's really kind of that shifting that mindset. So I want to ask you, Jed, in your experience that you've had in your roles, and especially here, we're talking about the book, what are some of those biggest obstacles that, and I know we hit on a couple of them, but, maybe just to kind of reiterate that, what are some of the biggest obstacles for educators to kind of make that shift and how can they overcome some of those challenges that they may face?
I think the biggest one, and you actually just set it up perfectly, is mindsets, and it's fixed mindsets and mindsets that are, you know, maybe have done one thing a certain way for a certain amount of time, and yes, it works, but you've got the classroom next door doing something totally different where kids are engaged at a different way and at a different depth, and they're accessing content, and you're seeing kids who are, excited to come into school. And I think, like I said at the beginning, I think about myself as a student. I always try to find myself as a student because that always informed my teaching. What did I need? And, it kind of goes back to that question we hear all the time. Would you want to be a teacher or would you want to be a student in your own class? Now, as an administrator, it's kind of like when I want to be a teacher working with me. And that kind of informs the work that I want to do and the growth and change I want to try to build over time. But really the biggest obstacle sometimes is, yeah, there's always going to be time and space and budget, but sometimes teachers don't have a pathway to change that. But I think teachers always have a pathway to kind of shift that mindset. Um, and it's the mindset is what I think builds the skill set. And the skill set is built by competencies. And those competencies, right? Every school district seems to be working on their portrait of a graduate. Those 21st century skills that used to be soft skills and now are essential skills. But how do we capture it? And that's what this book is about, is kind of, all right, how do we capture those things we say are really important, even though sometimes it doesn't appear on the tests, right? You've got your state tests or your different assessments that don't always align with the things that we know are those important skills we want our students to graduate with. And it goes back to whether it's high school projects or whether it goes back to those elementary projects, or like you said, instead of having printed product, right, your students could still go back and find those assignments that you had them put in their drives and they saved their product. They could go to them right now if they wanted. And think of how powerful that is, that they know it's out there. Because if you sent them home with a big rubber band stack at the end of the year, who knows where they would be right now. But the fact that it all exists and it does show growth over time. And that's something that's really a tough one for districts, is to catch that piece, is to assess growth, yes, over the span of a school year, but then over time in ways that are different from data points on graphs, but that really capture that creativity. It shows performance and it shows their learning practices and it shows learning process. You mentioned the word process. I mean, how do we capture process? All different content areas. whether it's the art, music, PE teachers. How are classroom teachers seeing what's happening in those spaces? And how are those specialists capturing that and showing what's going on other than, sometimes in a traditional building, it's once a year art shows, or is it field, and I don't mean to diminish those in any way because I see what's happening in those spaces, but how is what's happening in those spaces being seen and shared in a way that parents totally get it? And Seesaw is such a great example. Um, it's been really fascinating to watch kind of the post COVID backslide, backswing, pushback, right? And Seesaw is in some ways a casualty of it because it was such a quick go-to for so many districts to grab it as a early grade answer to Google Classroom instead, and being used very minimally as a parent communication tool rather than the learning portfolio it's meant to be. And then, a product like Spaces EDU, who I'm proud to have an association with, their portfolio product is amazing. And it's about student work. It's about capturing that student thinking. So I know your question was about the obstacles, but I think a lot of times the obstacles are people themselves and just sometimes challenging themselves, sometimes those priorities. And that's a piece I wrote about later in the book is, if you're looking to increase your digital literacy, the digital literacy of your space, of your students, it's too big to do it all together. So this framework I put together um, spans 4 domains, and it's called the Design for Digital Literacy. I originally called it Domains of Digital Learning. Either way, it's still DDL.
Yeah.
But what it really does, because teachers love acronyms, but what it really does is it breaks down technology integration or digital learning, or however we want to name what it is we know the work we've been doing for 20, 30 years, into 4 domains. Because if a classroom teacher, if a school, if a district is really looking to ramp up or leverage technology differently, chances are whatever the tool is, it's going to fall into one of 4 elements. And that's, is it instruction? Is it operation? Is it creativity? Or is it wellness? And then within each of those, that's kind of the model that I go into in the book. And that's where I want it to be practical. There's self-assessment. And then but there's something in this grew. You asked, where did this kind of germinate from? Um, it grew from workshops and conferences where, if I titled a session Beyond the Bulletin Board, right? Crafting a culture of content creation, you know exactly what you're going to be hearing about, using technology to leverage those tools. And then I frame it within those 4 categories. So I would say to a teacher, all right, pick one. Is it the instruction that you want to focus on? Is it operation that you need the support? And this came from coaching as well. Is it digital wellness you want to look at? And I'm intentional about wellness versus citizenship, because when you're talking digital citizenship, it's a question of who's doing the common sense lessons, who's doing it, who's pushing it out. But if it's wellness, it's a whole different conversation about students and how they're connecting, who they're connecting with, and their friends and social media and their footprint, in a way where digital citizenship is a piece. But now everybody's concerned. Very different from just who's covering that content. And then the 4th domain was creativity. So within those 4 domains, the challenge, and what's been really interesting is at a conference, I give out 4 cards to every person at the conference, and it's instruction, operation, creativity, wellness. And I say, all right, prioritize them for your urgency. So right away, people can put their first one on top. And then it gets really challenging. And if I asked you to do it, if I gave you those 4 cards, I bet you know your first one. But what's really hard is to put one last. It is not that you don't care about it, but it's hard to pick one that's not your top priority. So people sequence them. And then I'd say, all right, now tell me, where do you see the urgency in your building or your district? And it usually gets a ho, 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 and everything gets reshuffled. And there's something there about what teachers are passionate about, what they care about, how they want to be using technology, but the constraints that they're in. And then we go through, well, where's your wheelhouse? Kind of where are your roadblocks? And so thinking about it from that point of view, I tried to give a framework in this book for, okay, here's, 100 classroom strategies to support operation. Here's strategies to support instruction. Here's strategies to support wellness. So if a teacher wants, 101 things to try tomorrow, they're in there. They're kind of annotated projects and activities. But if they really want the thoughtful piece too about kind of building that craft and increasing the literacy, that's the why that this whole book is all about.
That's wonderful. But I want to
You could
ask
have
you
written this book. I know you could have.
and it's so funny, like, a lot of the great stuff that you're sharing is it's stuff that to me, it's just like I see it, I can envision it, and I'm like, man, I'm on this because I can I don't know. It's just something, and I don't want to say that I'm built different. It's just sometimes I see things a little different, and I'm with you as far as the risk taking and the innovation. But now I want to ask you about that too as well, because you emphasize the importance of fostering culture of innovation and risk taking and the learning environment. So I want to ask you, what would be some advice that you would give? Okay, we'll start off with this, not just the school leaders. We'll start off with school leaders first to cultivate this within their school culture, but then we'll take it also to the teacher to cultivate that within their classrooms. So, what would be your message to the school leaders first?
Well, I would say look at those 4 categories because that gives you a way to name it, right? And within those 4 categories, I might even say, rate do a school rating or a classroom rating if you're a classroom teacher. And then think about, okay, if you say that, instructionally you're pretty confident you're at a 7, I would say, okay, what would it take to bump it up 1? And then that gives actionable steps for a teacher to think about. And I would say through the lens of, you know, the technology that you find that you go back to repeatedly, why is it? And whether it is an AI brand new tool. And I said I wasn't going to talk about AI, but it's actually a handy way to really think about the intention of what we're doing rather than just the novelty of it, right? So is it really empowering student learning? Is it impacting student learning at the end of the day? Or are there shortcuts that are happening that are coming at some sort of cost? That's the interesting thing I've really been watching with AI is, yeah, it's great to give teachers that time back and it's great to add all this depth. Um, but I wonder over time if there's going to be some sort of an erosion of teachers' s- content, subject matter knowledge, because they've had so much help in expanding their units and their assignments, which is great from like a UDL perspective. You are finding ways. Um, or are they teaching so much better because of it? It's probably going to be a little bit of everything. But, you know, to get back to your question, my advice would be the tools that you're using. What's the, and I don't want to say return on investment, but what's the intention really? Are, are voices being empowered? Is it personalizing the process? Are you engaging students, like we both said, who might not otherwise be engaged? Do you see a social emotional component to it? And if you hand students um, iPads and you say, okay, you've got 3 minutes to make a commercial to talk about why digital citizenship is important, you're going to get something that's totally different from if you said, write a paragraph about why we should be a good digital citizen, because you're giving them the authenticity, you're giving them an audience. You're going to have kids who know exactly what an influencer does or says. They're going to hold it up and say, hey guys, here's why you should, and you get a totally different voice. And when we talk about student voice, that's like a great example. It's not just voice or no voice, it's which voice. And if you give an audience, then you're going to get voices that you're not capturing in different ways.
And like one thing that you mentioned, I know you said, as far as which applications or which platforms you're using. And obviously, sometimes the vision, well, not the vision, but people at the top, they're accountable too. So it's like the return on investment. But I always say like, the return on investment, we need to look at the return on instruction, so that to me
I
is the
like that.
biggest thing.
That's a good
Yeah.
workshop title.
Yeah, the return on instruction, because oftentimes too, I feel that, we need to see, okay, are the students engaged? And like you said, everything, like, are they giving a voice to those that may not have a voice? Are they being authentic? Are they being able to, garner those 21st century skills and be able to grow and cultivate that culture as they move on and see the importance of that? And I think to me too, one of the biggest things is this going to translate or transfer over into any additional skills, not only just within my classroom, but I want them to be transferable skills to other subjects. If I'm self contained, I want them to see and make that connection. And that's one of the things too that I wanted to share that it just came to mind. Those last 2 years that I was in the classroom, I was doing I was doing science and social studies, and we were kind of departmentalized. So we had just a teacher that just did math, and then the other one did ELA reading and so on, and I did science and social studies. But it was very interesting sometimes, and I don't know if it was just happened to me or if it happens to other people. But with the students, since they're kind of being siloed in a way, like when we were doing science and we were doing math, they're like, "Why am I doing math? Like, this doesn't make any sense. This is science. Like, there's no math in science." I was like, "Wait a minute." I was like, "There's math." And for some reason they found that math to be difficult, but I was like, "But this is just what you were covering with the other teacher." But they're like, "But this is science." So, to me, what I try to do is even within the science and the social studies was really to help them see and make those connections, which kind of brings me again to that beyond my walls and beyond my subject, to make sure that those skills transfer over to the ELA class, they transfer over to the math. And I think that's something that's very important. And that's what I feel that with implementing such tools and such teaching practices with technology, the students can be able to make those connections and not feel like, hey, well, this tool is only for math and I can only use it for math. And what I'm learning here and these skills are just math. But it just opens up a world to them, and that makes them better prepared, better digital citizens too. And as they continue to move on, they just have that skill set at the ready for anything that they may need. And again, they can go back and remember some of those platforms or have some of those digital artifacts that they have, which I really like. So that's really something that's really cool.
I love that you use the word transfer. Excuse me. Um, because that learning transfer, it's really making explicit, like, and it seems so obvious that students should know what they're doing. They should know why they're doing it. They should know how it connects to, hopefully beyond Friday's test, but how it connects to their world around them. And you'd love this because yesterday I was actually recording for a school district podcast, this fourth grade after school math club called Math All Around Us. And these kids' parents from all different industry came in and talked about how there's math all around us. And I asked these students, what is it? What do you mean there's math all around us? And they said, well, we just learned about dosing in medicine and prescriptions. And we just learned at the grocery store, you're trying to calculate prices. And there, all these ways that are so different from the calculations and computation in class. And there's no technology involved in that other than me recording that. But you do have to sometimes make that thinking explicit. And don't forget to ask kids, do you know why you're doing that? And certainly not trick them into it. And I always push back, and I always have at that idea of, kids are learning without realizing it. That's so condescending, whether it's coding or whether it's technology or whether it's, you don't want to suddenly reveal something. Students should know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that goes to, our whether it's objectives posted on the board and why is that? And when there does come a time, and there came a time with me where, yes, I was posting objectives because I had to, and the principal might walk in and see it. And I realized that I was chasing all these compliance tasks when really in, what I wasn't doing was providing that space where students had all these reference points to frame what they were doing, why they were doing it, beginning and ending lessons with making that really obvious. So there does come a time, I think, where every teacher kind of makes those connections about what makes sense for every student in the classroom, maybe not just themselves when they were a learner, or not just, the mainstream in the middle, but really reaching every student. And we do kind of keep coming back to a UDL theme, right? Whether it's learner transfer, but how are we? And that's where, you and I, with being tech enthusiasts, have for all these years now found ways of providing those multiple modes, whether it's for expression, or engagement or representing content. And that's where you get kids in different ways. But it does take, there's a flexibility because if you're going to represent content differently or allow students to represent their thinking differently, yeah, it's harder. It's harder. If you're giving an option of 5 ways students can demonstrate their learning, yeah, that's 5 ways that you need to assess it. But think of the power, think of the engagement of the students leaving your space had, knowing that you saw them in a way that maybe a previous teacher hadn't, or maybe in a way that their parents hadn't until you offer them seesaw. And it only takes one time for a parent to say, ah, it's like magic, right? They hear their students thinking in context. And think about, you also as a classroom teacher, suddenly when you have a parent teacher conference, you have a whole different lens to talk about when the student is part of the conference through their recorded explanations and thinking. And it doesn't become a performance piece at the end, but it becomes their own thinking on display over time.
I love that. I love that. So, a couple of things that I do want to unpack, but I want to touch on this one first that you mentioned here towards the end that when you do have a parent conference or you may have an IEP or a 504, that's the one thing that I love that I always came in with digital artifacts, recordings of the students and their work and so on, where oftentimes I would come in and there would be other teachers that would just, okay, so what is the student needing? What are well, they just need to study. Well, these are their grades, here are their quizzes. So what do you see as the problem? Well, they're not passing their quizzes. Okay, so what do you think that they need to do or what do you recommend? Well, they just need to learn this or learn the multiplication tables but that was really just their evidence. Again, it goes back to that final grade and final product as opposed to the process where I was able to come in and say, well, let me share with you the process that although the student may not be doing well, I want to show you where they were at the beginning, where they are up to this point that we may be having a mid-year meeting. And now it's something that they have visually that they can hear, that they can see, that they can go ahead and, digitally flip through and be like, oh, okay, and so on. And I think that's something that's very important. And for me, I always tell the teachers, a lot of this technology and a lot of these learning artifacts that I ask you to do and use with some of these mini projects, they're kind of like, one of those like kind of like cover your behind kind of deals too to help out during those meetings because you have some wonderful learning artifacts to share at those meetings and just be very specific and really help out because at the end I really want to help out the student. I mean, I want them to know like you're not just this label. Like, I mean, look at the work that you're doing. This does not define who you are. So that's something that I loved. And I wanted the parent to see that and say, look, although we're having this meeting and you feel that maybe your child is not doing well, I'm here to tell you they are progressing. There is this growth. You may not see it and you may not hear it from another teacher, but I'm here telling you, based on my evidence and based on the work that they're doing here, there is that growth. And then just to put parents at ease there, I think was something that was very important for me too, as well. So I love that. The other thing I wanted to touch on, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, you made me think of a story, and you're right. It's absolutely, and we'll use the example of multiplication and division, and you know, giving students a way to capture, how are they related? If that's the objective for students to be able to make the connection to how can multiplication help you solve a division problem, and you might have a student who can't answer it the way that the standardized test wants it answered, but you give them blocks, you give them the pieces, you give them the manipulatives, and they can teach it, right? What a powerful tool to say, 2 kids are out today. Can you make a video of what we just did, the mini lesson we just did, so that tomorrow they can watch that? So that gives you an opportunity to give them an audience. It also gives you a chance to assess their learning, and it gives them a chance to demonstrate their thinking and make it more concrete. And yes, you can put the parent at ease, who may not see the performance in the way that the performance is traditionally done, but you can say, yes, they do get it. And it gives them tools to support them. Now, what's interesting sometimes is the inverse when a parent assumes that students are really capable because they have memorized a million facts. But when they can't explain those connections, that's actually a really powerful moment too. And it's never from a gotcha point of view, but it gives you because students come in, they say, what can we do to be helpful? What do we need to work on? How can we support their students? So when you show that video of when there is confusion, they totally understand maybe where the breakdown in thinking is, or to be able to say, this is what they thought, this is what they figured out. And like you said, watch how they progress to think about it. But when you watch that progression, it just gives parents totally different perspective of that learning process, and in ways that, speed tests or memorized facts or scores on worksheet don't necessarily show. Um, Whether, they are able to do more than they know, or maybe not always to do as much as they think they can too. So it's just an interesting parallel. But at the end of the day, we're just talking about finding more and more ways to make that understanding visible.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to hit on, Jed, is when you talked about your podcast and you talked about students explaining math everywhere. One of my biggest things is that I love when students have time for discussion, discourse in the classroom, having being able to share ideas and so on, and being able to learn from one another. And I love the fact that they were able to do this podcast. You recorded them, but also, like you said, you heard, from their family members, their parents that, may be working in certain areas. And I know you mentioned this in the book. And for me, community was very big. What I would do too is reach out to my local community, which were some of the parents that were working, in some kind of science field or something related to that. I would even reach out to the city. Like if we were going over the water cycle, I would reach out to the city water, and then they would send somebody over to come and talk about water. They would come and talk about, the process and so on and so forth, and making those connections. And again, I think it's very great that it's going beyond the walls. And here we're going not only beyond the bulletin board of just the normal, water cycle that they would go ahead and color or create, but now you're going beyond the wall. And I think that because of the technology that we have nowadays, even just a simple Google Meet or a Zoom session, to invite a content expert to make those connections was so important for my class. And I know that they gained a lot from it. And also because of the representation piece, to especially in the area where I work, in my demographic area, to be able to find somebody that looks like them and they can say, "Oh my gosh, I can do that." Like that person looks like me and he's or she is doing this. I can do that too. And I think that's something that is very important. And so that's why I think that community partnerships in that sense are something that are great and can have a lasting effect on students as they continue to move on and making those connections to the content too as well.
Definitely. And they don't have to be major position. I mean, I think about a project I did last year with first graders where they invited their parents in and they interviewed their parents for a podcast to find out what they did for work and how is teamwork important and how do you work together with people and what skills do you need to know to do your job. And it was awesome. Two big discoveries where first graders really have no idea what their parents do for work. I mean, they might know what they are, but they don't know what their daily work looks like. And first grade parents are totally uncomfortable talking to a room full of first graders. And, especially if they're being recorded. So it puts everyone on this different, but I'll tell you what, you see the faces of these students interviewing their parents, and it's like they're watching them right there on TV. But it's the discourse you get. And you know, if it's a student interviewing a parent, or if it's having parents come in and talk to each other, and you're right, students seeing themselves in those faces is essential. And for the teacher to listen and let the conversations happen. And sometimes it's letting students struggle sometimes. And I know it's a different direction, but when you have students and you say, all right, how can you find a way to teach this concept? And you just say, here's a bunch of materials. How can you find three different ways to represent the same, right? So instead of a worksheet where there's 25 of the same problem, find three different or 25 ways to represent the same thing. And it's a total flip flop. But if you give students a camera or the tool or a task, and that task is to reteach it, suddenly it's not for us anymore. It's not a worksheet. It's not a transaction. It's not a grade. It's not a score. but they're teaching their classmates, or better yet, they're teaching next year's class. And that's a great one, one that I talk about in this book, and I've used it repeatedly, is at the end of a unit, have students make kind of an introductory lesson for next year's class to kick off a unit. And it gives the teacher total formative or summative assessment to say, how well do they really get this content? It actually gives the teacher a great kickoff lesson for next year. And it gives students a really authentic, right? It captures their voice. And they always put together an awesome project that kind of highlights. And yes, you map it out a little bit, you storyboard, or sometimes you just turn on the camera and, okay, in today's number corner, what did you learn? And you capture it. And yes, it might be for the students who are absent, or it might just be for that student to capture their thinking in that moment. But, video is nothing new, right? If it's a VHS camcorder when I was in seventh grade, or it's, literally holding up the phone now, the tool is different, but the pedagogy is there. And there's a reason we've always found different ways. And I've always gravitated toward different ways of engaging with teaching and learning.
Absolutely, and those are great. That's great. Well, Jed, as we kind of start wrapping up and everything, I just kind of wanted to ask you, beyond the bulletin board, we've talked about so many great strategies that are in the book, the content, what you're hoping to bring to teachers. So, what are some of those key takeaways for the readers? And, how do you envision your book to make an impact in the education space?
Well, I did, when I was thinking about why I wanted to write I really wanted it. I'm glad, again, you called it a practical guide, because I really wanted it to be either an integrator's toolkit, or a classroom educator's handbook, or an administrator's guidebook too. So when you called it a guide, I was really grateful, because for an administrator who, technology is not their background, and they have been working on becoming an administrator, but maybe haven't been following all the emerging trends in technology. And that goes whether you're an administrator or you're a veteran teacher. It hasn't been every educator's responsibility to teach themselves all these things that have come along, right? So that's where a book like this fits in, or roles like yours or mine fit in, is to support that. So, that's what this book is really intended to be, is to provide classroom solutions and strategies right away. And there's a section where it really aligns with the ISTE competencies. So we could think about, how are we having students become creative communicators and empowered learners? And hopefully it's not just what do we want them doing with technology, but who do we want them to become by using that technology? So it's, practical strategies for leveraging the technology. And then that middle section of the book, where it's the frameworks that provide it, whether it's across those four domains or through an ISTE framework too. So it can give that framing for those who need it that way. But at the end of the day, it's, how, like I said, how are we shifting from being content consumers to content creators? Is it aligned with the curriculum? Are we shifting the structures that have been maybe the obstacles in the way? Are we talking about learning transfer? Are we thinking about giving students authentic ways to demonstrate what they know? Are we demonstrating our excitement for being lifelong learners and our excitement about learning these new ways too? Or are we just bringing the same folder out that has copies of copies of copies? And, so hopefully, if teachers are repeating the bulletin board they've been doing for a long time, I know it's for a good reason, but I always think there's ways to really increase that audience, broaden the reach, give that depth, give that extra dimension to it, and then have it saved forever.
I love it. Wonderful. Well, before we get into the last section, with the last three questions, Jed, can you please tell us and tell all our audience members where and when, or actually where they can find the book? Because I know the book is out, but where's the easiest way that they can find the book?
Yeah, the book is out right now. It's only been out a few weeks. It's on Amazon. You can find it if you search Beyond the Bulletin Board, and Beyond the Bulletin Board book, or Stefanowicz, that's me, or even shorter. My website, jedpd.com. So Jed and PD for professional development. Although I do like to say professional learning better than professional development. But you can find more about me and workshops and podcasts and order books there as well. So yes, thank you. You can find them. You can find them there. Now I don't know what your final three questions are, so now I'm all nervous.
Well, they're the same ones from, that I was in the show with, but I just wanted to let you know, and all our audience members, we will make sure we put those links in the show
Thank you.
notes, so that way you can go ahead and make your way either to Amazon or go to Jed's website, and you can go ahead and find the book there too as well. All right, so here we go. The last 3 questions, Jed, very similar to the same 3 questions. The only one that changed was the last question from the last time you were here, and I know it's been a while since you've been here, so I would imagine that your EduKryptonite would probably be a little different. So I want to ask you, Jed, since the last time that you were here, what would you say is your current EduKryptonite?
Probably fear, probably teachers who are um, afraid to challenge themselves, and it's and I don't blame them. And it might be fear because something is overwhelming. It seems too much. It's too new. Um, so I would say to those teachers who are, reluctant to try something new, find someone who's doing it and just ask them, how'd you get started? What did you do? And that's what my previous book was about, was hearing those stories. And that's how I've done it, throughout my career, is finding people who do what I think is really interesting. It's a little beyond my reach, and just kind of saying, show me how you got started. And really those, like, a really personalized professional learning.
I love that. Wonderful answer. All right. Question number 2, Jed. If you could have a billboard with anything on it, what would it be and why?
Well, at the moment, it would probably be my book cover. But it would probably be, a challenge to just say, how are you capturing thinking? How are you? And it would be kind of like, we want you to reimagine what student publishing, we want you to reconnect with families and redesign what engagement and reassess students in a way that is meaningful to them and is understood by everyone. So it'd be a little pushy, but sometimes that's what it takes, is a little bit of a little bit of a professional guilt trip, you know?
Yeah, no, no, it totally works. I can see that kind of like I know like here in Texas when I'm driving up north and then we're obviously, we're headed towards Bucky's. We always see the signs for like, Bucky's this many miles, these many miles. So I can definitely see your billboard going from like beyond the walls and it's like rethink assessment,
Oh,
rethink
I like
creativity,
that.
rethink. And that would definitely catch my eye. I mean, everybody driving by, they're getting a different billboard. So I can definitely see that happening. That's a great one. All right, Jed, this is the question that probably changed from the last time you were here. So I got to ask you now, is there a particular hobby or favorite activity that is, let's say, non work related and maybe not deal with education at all whatsoever that you wish you could turn into a full time career?
It's interesting, and I wonder if you get this response other times, because for the reasons I think people have hobbies, they would never wanna do it as a full-time job. So if it's playing music with my band, if it's working with bonsai trees, which I do, whether it's engaging with kids in a different way, whether it's playing with my, with nieces and nephews, or parenting with my kids, all the stuff we love to do, escape rooms or whatever, all that creativity, if that became your full-time job, I wonder if it would take some of the joy out of it, and it wouldn't be your escape anymore. So I don't know. I'm happy to have a day job, and I'm happy to escape that day job and do the things that feed the other side to, in a capsule.
There you go. Yeah, that's a great answer. Honestly, first person to answer that way. I love it because it's very interesting that this is what I do. This is why I do this because luckily I have a full-time job, but this feeds that creative side and all of that. So I could definitely
Well,
see where you're at.
think about if you had to be, if this was your sole source of income and this was your full-time job, and you were, it would totally change it. It would diminish it, and it would put a different pressure and a different output and a different expectation for you, and you'd be chasing different things for different reasons, and you wouldn't love it, and you wouldn't feel like it's a creative outlet or escape, I bet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jed, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been an amazing conversation. I'm just really thankful again for you keeping me top of mind. Thank you so much for being a returning guest. Thank you so much for sharing the work that you're doing. And using this platform to help amplify your voice and your creativity and just bring some more knowledge and more amazing resources into our education space. So thank you, my friend. It's been an honor and a pleasure. And I absolutely loved meeting you in person. So hopefully we can run into each other again soon in the near future. And that would just be great just to catch up. And as always, Jed, you always have an open invitation on the show. So whenever your next book comes out, you can definitely call me up and you can go ahead and share that here as well. So thank you. I appreciate it and appreciate our friendship and our connection. Thank you so much.
It is my pleasure. It's super great to be here, and I'm glad you're doing this, after hours, and this isn't your job because it keeps it real and it keeps it meaningful. And I know it's something we both care about. And as much as we're not in classrooms with kids, as much as our hearts desire, we are reaching those end users. And like we began the conversation, all of this is about student engagement. All of this is about student learning, and all of this is about, right, the magic of teaching and learning that got us into the job in the first place. Tools might be different, but all the reasons are the same. So I appreciate you having me on again, and maybe we'll cross paths at ISTE in Denver.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. And to all our audience members, as always, thank you so much for all of your support. We really appreciate all the likes, shares, and follows. And if you haven't done so yet, please make sure that you follow us on all socials at My EdTech Life, at My EdTech Life. And also, if you can, please jump over to our YouTube channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please make sure you subscribe, give us a thumbs up. We definitely appreciate that. And make sure you visit our website at myedtech.life, where you can check out this amazing episode and the other 275 wonderful episodes with educators, creators, practitioners, professionals. We've got a little bit of everything for you. And I promise you that you can take those knowledge nuggets and sprinkle them onto what you are already doing great. So thank you as always for all of your support. And my friends, until next time, don't forget, stay techie.